You are listening to Eastmans Fly Cast, an adventure fly fishing specific podcast covering travel, tactics, and next level insight. Now your host, Brian Barney.
Yo, what's happening, guys? Got a brand new Eastmans Fly Cast for you. So this week I have on Brian Rosenberg. I met Brian about 20 years ago when I showed up in Ennis, Montana and walked into the fly shop. Brian was so gracious with information and shared his knowledge of the river and what was working and really helped me on my journey of fly fishing. And throughout the years, I've run into Brian, and we always chat and always have these quality conversations. And when I started this podcast, I knew Brian would be perfect for it. So I hit him up. He came out to the house, had a couple cold beverages, and just had this long, in-depth, quality conversation, and lucky enough to hit record and get the whole thing. So we went a little bit long. I'm going to release it in 2 parts to you guys, but it's just a great conversation. Brian has so much insight into fly fishing, so much insight into the ecosystem, dry fly hatches, why the fish are eating, where the fish are feeding. Just a great quality conversation with Brian. So I really enjoyed it. I know you guys are going to enjoy it too. Check out this week, Eastman's Elevated. I have on Travis Nowotny. Travis is just one of those guys that's consistently successful. Just harvested a giant chocolate bear with his bow down there in Idaho. 3 big muleys last year in the early season with his bow. He's just a blue-collar, hard-working guy. We had a great conversation on the Eastman's Elevated podcast. So make sure to check out that this week. Make sure to check out everything we have going on over there at Eastman's. This is just a really cool platform, and I'm really happy Eastman's has given me the chance to break off and do this fly fishing podcast. So I'm really enjoying it. Thanks to you guys for the support. Really tough to get a podcast off the ground and build an audience again. So I appreciate you guys following along, subscribing to the podcast. Ratings and reviews really help. Sharing it with buddies, I've seen that as well. I just really appreciate it, guys. You guys are the reason why this podcast works or this podcast is going. So thanks for the support. And man, let's get right into this conversation. Brian Rosenberg, you can follow him, Montana Fishman. He's got a website, also Instagram page, Facebook. Everything's Montana Fishman. Brian Rosenberg, just a pleasure to have a conversation with him. I know you guys are going to enjoy it. Well, I've got Brian Rosenberg on today, a good friend. Well, I met Brian about 20 years ago. I met you when you worked in the shop. I am so excited to get you on the podcast. I really feel like you put your 10,000 hours in. So thanks so much for coming out to the house, being on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. Like I said earlier, it's funny. I've listened to hundreds, if not thousands, of podcasts, so it's funny to be kind of on this side of it for the first time. I don't know that I ever thought that I would. So appreciate you having me, and thanks for Eastman to present it, and you for hosting. So
It's a cool media, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fun. It's podcasts in general.
Mm-hmm.
Just yes, yeah. It's an interesting way to get perspective and sort of, it's kind of like a really cool version of audiobookish kind of stuff, where it's good to hear people's voice, and you kind of get to hear it from the horse's mouth a lot of times. And, so it's a new experience for me for sure.
Yep. So you live here in Ennis, Montana. I met you when you were working in the shop. Now you've built this outfitting business. You've pretty much built your life around fly fishing. So Montana Fishman Outfitting.
That's it. Yeah, I jumped on that for better or worse, like back in the late 90s. Snatched up emails, bought a couple of website domain names, and I don't know that I knew that was going to be what I'd spend the next 20 plus years doing, and hopefully for another 20, 30, or 40 years too. But yeah, I really I got very fortunate, in sort of getting connected here, and those early days in the shop were, invaluable, right? Like I look at that, and especially now being a little bit older, having some different perspective, and you look back, and I look back and I say, gosh, how lucky am I to have fallen into this area. And I think that can be said about a lot of places for the young kid who fell into West or shops in Bozeman or Craig or anywhere, right? It's such a small world that all of a sudden you're just immersed in, tons of people that are really good at what they're doing. And so then it's like, if you want it, there's that info's there. We can go learn it, figure it all out, and copy what other people are doing until we figure it out for ourselves. But
mentors are key, aren't they? Like guys that really take you under their wing, really willing to share information with you. It just furthers your learning curve so much. But you've woven yourself with the fabric of this community and of fly fishing in general. Like you ate, slept, and breathed fly fishing when you first got you just had so much passion, running through you, the same way you do nowadays. But I could see it in you back when you started at the shop. You absolutely loved it.
I just don't have a sink full of dishes now that haven't been washed in 2 weeks. So that's really what's changed.
Well, that's good. As you get older, you do get better at taking care of responsibility for sure. No, that's a good thing.
Those early days, in the early days, you got to fish every day. So now I kind of I probably actually fish less days than I did, between the ages of 20 and 30. I have now the information to kind of cherry pick my time a little bit, right? And so I think in the early days, though, there's no way around that. Like, to learn what are the good zones and the good times, and even if that time is different week to week and year to year, like, those early days, the only way to figure that out is to be out every single day. And so now, you kind of being a little older, it's easier to go, okay, well, today's maybe not the right day, but we were talking about that earlier, where Sunday was the right day and I was still locked up doing chores, unfortunately. But yeah, I kind of, I miss that a little bit. I miss that sort of fish every day, like good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, I say I probably have more success each time I go, and that's just knowledge and time. And but that's kind of being able to cherry pick some of those windows too, where before I didn't know what those windows were. So you got to be out there until you see that window and then go, oh, okay, here's that window. And now I can focus time on that the next time around.
That makes so much sense. It's just that time and experience on the water. And once you pay your dues, you're right. You get to windows into when it's going to be good or when you need to be out there. Mm-hmm. And it's that same way, like, makes me think of like my bear season. I used to go so hard in April after bears and just paying my dues and day after day. And you don't see many in the early season. Not all bears are out. They're not all out from their dens. They're not keyed on the grasses or the food source yet. And so, like, I just had to spend those days to figure out when it was good, when the grass looked right at a certain elevation, when the bears would pop, where they would come out, where the snowpack is. But now I'm way more effective, even though I spend less days. There's been bear seasons that out of 60 days, I spend 55 days hunting. And same as you, where you're just out in the evenings, after work, and I'm able to just be out a lot. But now I'm able to cherry pick it a little bit better, where I'm able to go, no, it's not quite right yet, and then go out when it's really good and see 10 of them in 3 days or see 15 of them in 3 days. And so you're right. With experience, you're just able to time things better. And this river in fly fishing is all about timing and Mother Nature and reading water flows, water conditions. Isn't it? It's once you pay your dues, then you get keyed in pretty good to how those hatches are going to come off or when it's going to be good fishing. Yeah. So like Sunday, you're talking about
learning that general time pattern.
Yeah. So March Browns.
Yes, March Browns. We were talking about March Browns earlier. So that that window can be muddy. That window could be clear. Just depends, year to year, it's going to be a little bit different. There's always going to be those bugs. Those bugs are going to do what they do, regardless of the water conditions. But if those water conditions aren't good for us, then, we don't get that dry fly fishing day. Or in the case of Sunday, it's like, this is probably one of those days, calm, overcast. Like, it wasn't really rainy, but it was warm. We didn't see the mud that we had overnight, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, this is probably the day. This is going to be a day where there's going to be, bugs drifting on foam lines and noses, and it's like earlier saying, gosh, sometimes a guy should just rip himself away from whatever the heck he's doing and go. And I didn't do it on Sunday, so I don't regret hardly anything in life, but I do kick myself a little bit for not kind of going when I probably should have gone, for sure.
Well, you're out all the time, yeah.
Yeah, no one should feel bad for me. I get to fish a lot.
You missed one day on Sunday, but
yeah.
boy, you get a lot of good days out there. But yeah, those March browns, they come no matter what the water conditions are like. They're more temperature and time of year. So like when you're talking about it, like you say like our river is chocolate mud right now. But sometimes this hatch times right where these bugs come off in the chocolate mud and there isn't much fish in them.
Yeah, I don't know, if those fish are going to sit in the shallows and still be able to feed on nymphs. I mean, fish got to feed. Like, they don't know. They know it's muddy because they all of a sudden can't see as much, but they still feed. I mean, we've all had opportunities to catch fish in muddy water. That really does take dry fly fishing out of it. I mean, I've been out there in that silvery water where it's not green and it's not mud. And if it's a shallow foam line, you can, if they can see a foot or two, they might eat. But like this year, really seemed to line up well. As many times as I didn't get out for it, but that sort of like we had some early snow melt that didn't make it muddy, and then there's really not unless we have a lot of heat, there's not this big risk of mud for this happened to be a couple weeks, but sometimes it's 10 days. You don't need much. Like, you just need to get into that early to maybe mid-May around here to get that March brown, some of that activity. Unfortunately for us, that can coincide like dead smack with the beginning of full bore runoff. This year, not so much. We either didn't have enough of it, really, that super low snow, when we had that heat in kind of late April, mid to late April, and it came up a little, but it kept its clarity, and then it's like, okay, well, until the mud comes, like, got to kind of go look on the good days, and I definitely had some great moments. I didn't see that like hatch where you're gonna be in it for 2 or 3 hours, and you can walk away from one spot and go fish another to rising fish, and then go back to the spot you were fishing and find them rising again, and that's kind of like most of our hatches when we get them in that way. Like, that could be, that probably happens every year. It's just I may not have seen the day every year. So that's kind of one of those, every so often, like a fish, there's days that are unicorns too. And some of those unicorn days are not necessarily revolving around a particular fish or a big fish, but it's just that everything is right in the world. Like, it's drizzling lightly and it's not windy, and there's bugs floating for 30 yards before they fly away, right? And so every fish is like, okay, time to look up.
Oh, it's so fun when it's like that. Well, and sometimes you get the bugs and the fish aren't eating them. That's the craziest thing, is when you hit the hatch right and there's bugs everywhere and you don't see any fish coming up. That kills me. I got a really good caddis hatch down on the lower when it first went off this year, where I ran way up the canyon up there and fished, and I was able to get a couple of them up there, but the caddis were all over the place and the fish just weren't looking up for them.
Yeah.
And they didn't look up from the afternoon all the way till dark. I tried to stay out there thinking, oh, maybe as it gets later. Sometimes those fish...
Do you know where you were? Like, in the process of that hatch, were you on the first couple of days of bugs?
Yep, first couple days of bugs.
Yeah.
Was I too early on it, you think, where they weren't keyed into them yet?
It's all anecdotal, man. I don't know. So, yes and no, right?
Okay.
So, one of those things, like, so what I found anyway with Mother's Day caddis, or those super hatches like that, there's those first few days where they're actually popping through the surface and they're actually hatching, and, it seems like there's not, it seems like there actually are millions, gajillions, bugs. They're just not on the water very much, like like the blue wings, our blue wings and March browns. Those mayflies on a good cloudy day sit. On a sunny, warm day, if they hatch, they fly, so they don't sit very long. But then I feel like the Mother's Day caddis hatch, from a dry fly perspective, is really about the egg laying, because they're going to come back. A lot of them, I think, do dive. I think that species does break through the surface and kind of wants to go back down and deposit eggs as an adult. And so then there's this like window where the emerger fishing, soft hackle fishing, like that kind of stuff can be really good in riffles.
Okay.
And then all of a sudden there's a few days after, 2 days, 5 days, 4 days, whatever it is, those bugs kind of start to come back in mass, and then they start egg laying for, however much time after that, a good week or so. And then that's kind of when I found that evening thing. The afternoons down there are funky sometimes, that low river. I mean, there could be mats and mats of bugs around, and dead ones and spent caddis, and they're really not eating them until close to dark, But then you see all the weird stuff too, like you get cool weather during that hatch, and then nighttime, those evening temps drop below 58 or 56, and the bugs just disappear. They don't fly at a certain temperature. So I kind of feel like that's somewhere in that high 50s. So that sun falls, and if it's not a 70 degrees, high 70s warm day, like that temperature just drops, and all of a sudden there's not a caddis one flying around, and
That's
then
exactly
they quit
right.
eating.
Yep.
Heck, I've been down there walking up that canyon and go here and there on caddis, and there's plenty of them around. But another bug that happens down there, and we were talking about it earlier for the upper river, is the March brown hatch. So they spinner fall and egg lay at night as well, or in the evenings. And some of my best fishing down there, when I can't get them to eat egg-laying caddis or spent caddis, and there are fish rising and you can see them, and they just refuse presentation after presentation, and I'll switch to a big spinner, just a big thin-bodied mayfly pattern, and first drift over, and you're like, huh. And then, I start like looking around and go, oh, well, there's a big cloud of March brown spinners above me, and so that's that's like a little tricky one down there because it coincides. And if it's a good warm evening and there's caddis around and you see those sort of angelic sort of clouds, mayfly spinners are rising and falling in a column kind of, don't hesitate to switch to that big mayfly because they sometimes are just on that more for some reason. But yeah.
Man, there's so much to it. It's like, and so much bro science that goes with it too, trying to figure out your own experience out there and what it means, and trying to tie it to your own fishing.
Oh gosh.
Gosh, the best blue wing olive hatch I got on. I'll fish those smaller rivers, that Ruby Beaverhead, big hole over there that dump into the Jefferson. I love those streams as well, making a run over there. So I've got this run that I figured out this spring that was really good streamer fishing. I'd walk down to it, and gosh, sometimes I'd swing 3 of those things up in there, and they were all just really nice 20-inch plus browns out of that thing. So I did this big hike down the river, and I was coming back, and I got to that run. And that run was full of big browns, and they were all eating blue wing olives. Nice. And all I had was my streamer rod on me. I had my streamer rod with my weighted line. I thought about running to my truck and coming back and trying to bring my dry fly rod, and it was just like I just don't even have enough time. So I just stood there on a rock, and I just watched them eat, just one after the other, these great big brown trout coming up and eating these blue wing olive. And then finally I couldn't stand it anymore, so I had to throw a streamer in there. And
what are you going to do?
I did get one of them. Good fish on a streamer, but that was the best dry fly fishing I saw all year, and I didn't have a reel with me. I didn't have a dry fly line. I just didn't think I was going to see it that day. I thought it was too cold, but they went off that day. And of course I went back the next day and tried to find it, and then they didn't go off the next day. It's just it can be so temperamental, these hatches, and getting keyed in, but there is nothing funner than catching a fish on a dry fly, and there's nothing funner than getting keyed into these hatches too, and when they're happening and why they're happening. And so it was so nice you brought me over some of your salmon fly patterns from years ago that we talked about a pattern 10 years ago that came out, and you brought me out some prototypes. And I love that salmon fly hatch, and that's one of the ones that I really get keyed into, and I feel like I learned so much about fish's feeding habits and the bugs and the hatch. You just, when you immerse in those hatches and chase them around, you learn so much. And I really wanted to get into squallas earlier this year. I caught some fish on squallas on the Madison. I could just never really find it that thick. I think I've got to go farther west. I think they get some good squalla hatches. Do you get into good squallas around here?
I don't chase them up northwest that much.
Yep.
I feel like they've been here ever since I've been here. No one talked about them like in my early days. So my early days I was here spring of '99. That's when I showed up.
Yeah, me too. That's exactly when I came. That's funny. I
visited the first time in '96, and then finally got a job here in '99. And I feel like they've always been around. but we just don't see a lot of them. I think we get more of them through the canyon. Definitely get more of them down through the Valley Garden stretch.
That's
going
where I
into
was
the
finding
lake.
them this year. Yep.
And so anything above town, Varney to the lake is always, worthwhile if you're not traveling for it. If you're going to stay here and try to fish it, like everything, it's like if we like streamer fishing or we like any type of fishing, we kind of just have to go do it, right? There are going to be days where they'll eat it well, and a good day of squalla fishing here is 15 to 20 fish, you can rise on a full day, say Varney to town.
That's
9
good
miles.
fishing. Yeah.
That's pretty darn good.
I'd take
squalla
that day.
fishing.
Yeah, you betcha.
But then we start just fishing it because we like to fish it, and we might do the dropper behind it or whatever. And if you get 2 or 3 on it, it can be fun if that's what a guy wants to do. Like it's around. But then the Jeff and the Big Hole. From our regional standpoint, those are definitely our good squalla rivers. The Ruby is a sleeper for squallas for sure. You can run that small chubby small squalla stone there as we're getting into that same time period of blue wings over there, and sometimes do really well. Like that's definitely a sleeper creek for squallas locally. I've not been on it in that sense on the Bitterroot and that stuff up there where it's like our salmon fly hatch where you actually see hundreds of them flying upriver, thousands of them sometimes. So be good to do, 20, almost 21 years in Montana now, and I've not fished the Bitterroot squall hatch, right? It's like
there's so much to do.
Too much water, too little time.
Yeah, there's too many fun things to do is the problem. I'm the same way. I set that goal this year, and then with all the COVID stuff and traveling around and trying to be responsible and then family and the whole deal, I didn't make it out there. But I did see a couple fish on squallas, and that lower end down by the lake, yeah, it was good down there. So you talked about fishing a dropper. You're right, there's a style of fishing that you're almost gravitated towards, but I do think fishing that chubby as a lead fly and fishing a rubber leg dropper underneath it, no weight, short leader, it feels like you're able to get in a lot more of those shallow spots and nymph out a lot of those fish that aren't in the heart of the run. And in the springtime, it seems like a lot of them are sitting in there. Boy, is that effective way to fish for them.
Yeah, that chubby thing, I mean, that kind of revolution. So I'm a big dry fly fisherman all summer. So I nymph a lot in the winter, and I nymph clients, in the summertime as well. A lot of it's condition oriented. Like if we get a north wind where we just can't get cast downstream, right? And that's sort of a Western boat dry fly fishing. Like we just need it downstream of the boat. There are times where we just switch away from it, but that dry dropper thing, and in that form, when we saw that bug come, it really, I think, helped. I would say, like from my standpoint, I'm always trying to teach casting. So I want you to catch fish. I kind of firmly believe we can catch as many fish on dries as we can on nymphs any given day. And so like that was a great way to still be teaching dry fly fishing, still be teaching the cast. And then if they're not rising that well, or they're very specific to a line, like they won't move 2 feet or a foot to eat something, they're only going to move an inch or two. That just keeps that person busier, that dropper, whether it's the rubber leg or we're getting into July where, it's cliche, but it's a prince nymph, right? I mean, you can run it, for 30 days and catch fish on it. Those bugs behind those types of flies just really help, I think, keep people engaged with the fishing. They're getting some fish, but secretly I'm still working towards my goal of like having a dry fly angler, basically having an angler that can cast. Because if you can cast a dry fly, you can cast a streamer, we can adjust it. But if I get you throwing, nymph rigs and bobbers and open loops and things like that, it can be hard to come back and get those beginners to fish the dry and tighter loops. But if I can get a tight loop and some kind of presentation downstream, I can easily get a wide open loop and nymph. So I always find catching fish, it's easier probably to get people initially on a nymph, but I kind of find that by the end of the day, like a single dry, if I can get people to stop their rod tip early on a back cast so they can punch an angle downstream at the water, I mean, it's not that hard to get fish to come up around here. I mean, we're fortunate. We live on a river that was purpose built for dry fly fishing. It's 2 feet deep, and a lot of the water we fish is 6 inches. So it's like they don't have to do anything. There's no work. They don't got to come up from the bottom of an 8-foot run on the Yellowstone or whatever it is. It's like they just got to tip up. That's all they have to do. And I feel we're fortunate, I think, on the Madison in particular, that we can fish dries for so long. This time of year, it's a mixed bag. I mean, we went over to the Big Hole not too long ago looking for some of that early caddis, maybe see some blue wings, whatever. And it's just not really happened. There was some squalla fishing. We got about 4 or 5 fish up on squallas, but the streamer bite was fine. So, we just, you fish into squalla for an hour and get a bite, and the guy in the back's turned 3 fish on a streamer. It's like, oh, well, we'll throw the streamer, It's like, as much as I love that dry fly fishing, I also like to get bit. So I'm kind of, in the early season, I'm like wishy-washy. I'm like, I really want to be fishing dries every day, but it's not quite time. Like, as much as we're like, dry fly season is here, we're always early. We just kind of chasing that dream early. But by late June, we're just super fortunate. This river, from mid to late June, when it starts to clear, obviously that's the salmon fly time, big brown bomber caddis, from there until kind of those first cold fronts in September, we can run dries. Like, there's just no, and it's, I do it. That was sort of the way I learned. So I kind of came into the shop world and the guiding world here, where most of the people were teachers. They, or they did construction, and they worked that shorter summer season back then. And so people nymphed and people did all that stuff, but most of those guys did dry fly fishing and, did the other stuff that we kind of have to, before and after. Obviously streamers in the fall and, streamer fishing and dead drifting and all that in the spring too. But, yeah, it's definitely changed, I think there's definitely that push to get people on fish, which is easier with some nymphs sometimes, but after 20 years, I'm like, I'm not sure it's that much easier. Like,
I'm not sure it is either.
A single dry is super easy to cast. Like, I mean, even if it's this big wide open loop that gets just piled on itself, just lift the rod up a little bit, stretch the leader out, set it down, we'll chase it. Like, that doesn't seem that hard to me. But I think it did seem a lot harder when I was first learning it, and I'm still learning it. But the early days, I was very stubborn. I mean, I fished dries like every day. Like, it didn't matter. You want an nymph, you got to find another boat. Like, this was, that was in those days where, like, that's what we were learning to do as guides, because that's what we were taught. I didn't do my first serious nymphing as a guide until probably 8-9 years in.
Wow.
Right. And then I learned how to nymph, and I learned how to nymph from some of the best guys that nymph on this river, like Brandon Struckman and, some of like Gunner and those guys. And you're like, I'm going to learn it. Like, let's see what it is. Right. And I embraced it. I ran a whole year, 2 years where I was like, I'm going to do it till I feel like I have it perfected. And then I started moving back. I'm like, I'm going to go back to dry fly fishing. And, yeah, it's been an interesting run for sure. That dry fly side of things. I just think it's super easy to throw a single dry. So I'm like, why not?
So fun, isn't it? Well, and there's some things that go into it. You have to have the right pattern that floats right, that you can mend, that you can fish, that you're not just recasting all the time. So much of the time, you just got to leave that fly in the water. Let that fish see it. Like, get it in that seam that you want it and mend it in there and let it go down. Let them see it. But I think that takes, like, as we're talking to experienced and beginner anglers, like, a lot of it in the beginning is finding the right pattern that fishes right for you, that you can see, that floats right, and also the right size and shape that fish will eat it. Do you find that? Are you pretty dialed in on your patterns nowadays? I'd imagine that you're not trying too much different, that you've got it pretty dialed in on which patterns on which hatches catch fish.
Yeah, so I yes and no. I love new patterns. Like, I like flies, so it's kind of like gear or anything else that's just good gears. It's fun to just peruse and shop and look at it. And even if I don't buy that fly to really fish it a lot or buy a bunch of them to fish, I might pick that fly up to get an idea, right? There's just so many good ideas out there anymore. Like I'm a wonderful tracer. Like I don't know that I have an original pattern. Like I'm like I may have modified stuff and taken things and changed them or reduced. I'm a reductionist fly tyer, so I've got a rule about 5 and 5. If I can't do it with 5 materials or less in under 5 minutes, I'm kind of like I tie half-hour streamers and stuff. I do that. But most of my working flies like have to fall into that pretty simple category.
I love your social media too, and your fly tying
thank
is
you.
just so next
Thank
level.
you.
But I love seeing all your new ties that come out. Yeah, you're constantly working at it. So go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt, but
I'm like,
I love following along.
A new pattern for me is like one that I can take from 4 materials to 3 materials, and it works the same, right? It floats the same, works the same. I'm not an additionist fly tyer. Like I see certain patterns and I go, well, let's remove those 4 materials and get it back to basics. And it's like, and so I end up with a really basic selection. I mean, I literally like droppers. I fish a lot of freaking prince nymphs and pheasant tails and hare's ears and there's wonderful flies out there. There's all these crazy new flies, and none of those are actually dry flies since we're talking about dries. Things like variants on elk hair caddises. Purple haze really took over the parachute Adams role. But those flies, they work day in and day out because they look like a lot of the food sources. So I find that most of what I fish does fall into that category. It's very generic. It's going to float for a long time. It's pretty durable. I do incorporate foam, CDC, elk hair, all that kind of stuff. Widow's web is a great synthetic material for that. So my personal, like what I would day-to-day fish with clients is pretty simple. And I kind of have a long-term goal of like fishing 100% of what I tie, which I don't. There's a lot of stuff I do buy in here and there. So that goal actually really focuses me into basically super reductionist, because like if I'm going to tie everything I'm going to fish, I need to have, say, a caddis pattern that I can scale or change the color of very easily. Like I can't have 6 different caddis patterns that I got to tie, right? I've got to have one that I can change a color or a size, and that's fine. And that fits into my my philosophy a lot, because I'm much more, and this is a Madison learned thing, I guess, a Madison centric thing, I would say. And not all the Madison is this way, but that presentation trumps fly selection, like 90, almost here 99% of the time.
Doesn't it though?
Wow, it
That's
really
amazing
does.
to
It
hear
really
from
does.
you.
I
Yeah, I
mean,
like to hear
95,
that.
okay,
Yep.
like the bro science, whatever it is, maybe it's 85% of the time. There are plenty of times where a good blueing olive emerger in the spring is going to get them better than a size 16 purple haze. But if that fish, if it's feeding and it's timed right and it goes over it in a good way, that fish is going to take advantage of that bug. Like that's what that fish is built to do. It's not built to scrutinize your bug in a way that we scrutinize it, I feel. Things like the Missouri, Spring Creeks, that can get different, and we start to see it here late summer. You see fish fin up and track a fly 12 or 15 feet, that's a long, but they might track it 8 or 10 feet, sort of being pushed by the current, looking at it. And that's that's, is it tippet, is it drag, is it, the fly at that point. But yeah, so I'm a presentation over fly selection a lot, but going kind of touching back on fly patterns. My fly patterns are very simple. I mean, I probably run 12 or 15 patterns 90% of the time, and that's nymphs and dries. I'm always doing weird things, but I might tie a weird fly that works really well, and I kind of forget that it worked really well because everything kind of can work really well. And so I have patterns that I've tied and then go out of usage because I just forget to retie them, or I didn't make the note about that maybe worked better. But so I'm a very simplest sort of tyer for sure, and bug selector. I kind of learned a lot of that from in the early days of being in the shop. For us, or for me in particular, and some guys, Dave Scully would be like a legendary dry fly guide for us. So he would always come in about the last half hour because he was out there, full day, long time. So he'd come in the last hour or so. It wouldn't be busy. He would sit there and really cherry pick certain flies, and he would come in and basically restock on 2 flies for a month or 2. That's all he, I'm sure he's fishing other stuff, but those are what he might have been fishing. And like his early tips about, trimming and trimming hackles and just kind of getting a fly to do what you want. Like, and you'll still see him do it occasionally. If you're watching him across the river, he might tie on a fly and have a person cast it and watch it drift by the boat, bring it back in, take a scissors, trim things up, move things around,
wow.
split a wing, throw it again. Because sometimes flies will, even if we tie them really well, they tip over. The wing's a little long or something like that. And so a pair of scissors was one of the things I learned really early on. And then a fly in a bin is sort of a bit of a canvas. Like, it's a pattern. Like, it's a finite pattern that someone tied specifically because they think it works and believe it works and maybe proved it works. But then it's also sort of a loose canvas. Like, you can change that fly. You can cut the bottom off the hackle.
Color it with a marker.
Yeah, like old Schroeder's hoppers, Ed Schroeder's hopper, which is a great fly if you want to fish it. But like splitting the wing on that, splitting that turkey into 2 or 3 things so it kind of flares out and sits better. And so that was a big one for me early on, like learning that. And Dave, I'm not saying he doesn't tie, but he fished store-bought flies a lot, but they were his flies because he was changing them on the river. And I used to get stuck in that mentality that like a really good guide or even a really good angler should be tying their own flies, and that just blew that up. Like, he doesn't have to tie fly 1, right? He just knows what it needs to do and the way fish want to see it, and that's really, sort of came down to it. So I kind of backed off that, like, only good guides are fly tires. And it's like, no, not the case. Not the case at all.
So interesting.
One of those humbling experiences, a younger guy for sure, going like, we have these things in our mind that this is how it should be. And it's like, no.
Not always, right?
Not ever, really, right? Like, that's the other thing about our expectations, is they're always getting burst,
That's so interesting, yeah, because I'm always picking up flies, I'm looking at flies, I'm tying flies, I'm copying flies, I make changes, but really, like you, I've got about 12 patterns that I really like. I find the patterns that I like in streamers. I don't fish anything else. I fish white, black, green, and those colors, maybe a green and white, and then same thing with nymphs. I try to find some other nymphs, but I just have, like, when I have a proven pattern that I've caught fish off of, it just seems like when I'm hunting for fish, I want to be hunting with those patterns on, and if they're not going to eat that pattern, they're probably not going to eat, and whether that's a San Juan worm, a prince, a pheasant tail, a rubber leg, and a bunch of different rubber legs I like, but you just find these patterns over the years, and then each dry fly hatch, I seem to try out about 3 or 4 patterns and kind of come up with my own that I really like, and then tie it in a couple different sizes, and then I'm good to go. I don't look anymore. I've got my pattern that works for that hatch, for that fish. But it's interesting to hear you talk about that you're the same way, because I know you're always working on your ties, and you're always adjusting things and moving things. I also think that's interesting how you say, like, looking at that fly and how it floats and how it fishes and changing it up. I don't carry scissors with me, and I don't trim my flies, so that's a really good tip for me. That'll help me out.
Yeah, oh gosh, now I'm like, if there's, and I don't trim a lot at the bench, right? Certain flies, they are what they are. If I'm gonna have a palmered hackle type fly and I want it trimmed, I'll probably just trim it at the bench so I don't have to do it on the water. But yeah, a pair of scissors is good for sure. Like, touching back on the chubbies and things like that, like, that's now a fly that they still eat it pretty well, but they don't quite eat it like that first year, those first
that's
2 or 3 years that they saw it.
Yep.
You can take that fly and trim it down into this little nubbin of a foam synthetic bump.
Oh, really?
And all of a sudden, like, fish are just, eating it again, right? Because they all have these long legs. And you start looking at it and you go, well, it's, we're not trying to really precisely mimic anything right here. But if I take that fly and I trim the legs down, it looks a little more real. If I trim the wing down a little bit, it looks now a little bit more real. Still floats well for a customer. And then the mini chubby thing, like, that again, those things just revolutionized getting beginners to fish dries, because, we went away from things like, Royal Wolves and Trudes, and Goddard's still a great fly, but Goddard's caddis. And some of those flies, even though they floated very well, they can still be difficult for beginners to fish. Whereas the modern stuff, we started putting synthetics, and you start seeing foam. I'm like, mend the crap out of it if you have to. Sink it. It's going to pop right back up. Like, we're good. Like, it's going to float, and then we'll chase it. We'll float it. Yeah. And some of that's floatant and all that stuff too. But it was neat to see that stuff. And I mean, you kind of look at it and you go, gosh, it's one of those things. Like, wish I'd have thought of that. But I'm glad someone did. Right, because I'm like, I'm not, not proud. I'm like, I'll take that fly and just,
I fished the heck out of it. Yeah, exactly. Well, I love what you're saying at cutting that down. I also think a different profile and a different presentation. I've always thought my own ties catch more fish, and not because they're better ties. It's because the fish don't see them all the time. They're not sold in any of the shops. They're not going down on anybody else's rod but mine.
Oh, absolutely.
So every time those fish see it, it's a new pattern. And it may be something I copied or changed from somebody or changed something here, but it's a proven pattern for me. So I've always believed that. But I like that tip of cutting that thing down. Yeah.
Like if your fly is definitely a little bit different than the other hundreds, thousands of flies that they see, there's something to be said for that. I mean, that kind of knocks that presentation trumps fly selection a little bit. Like, it sort of kind of pushes on that theory a bit. But yeah, it's like if 100 of us are fishing the same tan, full size, full dress chubby, like, what's the one that gets trimmed down a little bit? Like, does that one get eaten a little bit better? So, I like that stuff. And then I think your own patterns, right? Your own patterns, it's like, it's a confidence thing. If you've caught fish on them, they might be, just close enough to whatever it is they're fishing or floating, but then it is just something a little different too. So I think that's a good thing. And that, again, it's sort of like, now I'm like, well, should I re-question the whole presentation fly selection thing? But it's just a little different is all. It's still something that's kind of generic, right? When I talk about that presentation fly selection thing, I think I envision things like the Henry's Fork, right, where you might actually have to fish a knockdown dun because that fish is specifically eating a fly that is a knockdown. Like, it's not eating a splayed spinner, or it's not eating a full dun. It's eating one that got blew over by the wind. And that stuff does happen on certain rivers and certain creeks, and thankfully for us, it doesn't happen that much here. Or if it does, we can just move away from that fish, and 10 yards down, there'll be a different one that wants to eat it. But, yeah, that stuff it's bizarre because it's like there are places where, the presentation doesn't mean anything if it's not actually what they're eating. And I think we're lucky enough here that that's not the case for sure. Not most of the time.
Well, and I think that translates, like you say, there's always the exception. But that presentation, it seems like it always trumps. The guy that can really fish that fly well, you can have two guys fish the same fly, the same leader length, and one guy catches more fish. It's due to presentation and his drift and just his feel for it, too, and his reading the water as he goes down. But there's something with getting in tune with it. But I think you're right. Whether it's 85, whether it's 95, whether it's 99, presentation is king.
I say it all the time. Yeah, presentation. It's kind of like, it's like the what's the real estate thing, location. Sometimes that's actually true for us too. Like, there are times where they won't move a foot, like, and you're like, no, it needs to really be like right there within an inch. And those are tougher times for us for dry fly fishing. Those times when they won't leave a spot to move and eat a little bit, that can be definitely tougher for us, because sometimes when they get locked into that lane that might be an inch or two wide and 4 or 5 inches outside of that, and they're just not going to come up for it. So luckily we see so much big bug fishing that there's a lot of the time of year our fish will move to eat. Salmon flies being one of them, squallas being another one. Post salmon fly is one of those times. I feel like if I have to look at probably my most difficult dry fly fishing time of the year, would be in that kind of post salmon fly period. And some of that I think is fish are full, right? That whole bit, their bellies are crunchy, full of bugs. But they don't have to move to eat. There's caddis, there's starting to be PMDs, there's maybe remnant golden stones, their bellies are still full of salmon fly, nymphs and adults, and they literally have to make no effort to eat anything. And then as we get into that like second, third week in July sometimes, all of a sudden you'll see a fish literally go 3 or 4 feet to eat something again. And those are happy times again, because you're like, okay, now the presentation doesn't have to be so precise for that person. Like, they can be a foot off the spot, and that fish will veer out and grab it. And then we get the nocturnals. We're so lucky. We get to fish big bugs for 5 months if you want, like from squallas through to salmon flies, goldens, nocturnal stoneflies or summer stoneflies in the late season.
It's the
hoppers,
funnest. Yeah.
I mean, we literally have 4 to 5 months of big bug fishing. If it's not great all the time. Like, there are times
Hit and miss.
we got to run that. Got to run the caddis or a little mayfly dropper if we're going to fish Dries exclusively, and that keeps us busier. That can keep keep more fishing going. But if a guy wants to, like, we can fish. The person can fish that big dry anytime up here. So
that's what I love too. It just attracts those big mature fish, that really get me excited. They eat those dry flies, and so I love that. I love that. The salmon flies and the squalla, the March browns, you can even see some good ones. And then last year's hopper hatch was just insane. They ate that thing so good all summer long, it's just amazing. But it's those bigger fish that key into those patterns. And I started off dry fly fishing and catching fish off caddis and all the smaller hatches all summer long, and then I kind of found out that there was bigger fish in this river. You start fishing some of these bigger patterns and started fishing nymphs and streamers, and all of a sudden you start to see this another level of a trout, of a brown trout. So I got hooked again, like fishing those big patterns, and so that's those bigger hatches that come off. Those are the ones that I really key into and go hard for. The salmon flies, I don't take a salmon fly off my rod for a month, and even if I'm not catching anything, I just want to go down and throw that thing because the one might come up and eat it, and same thing with those hoppers. Such a fun hatch because those bigger fish are really keyed into it. But while I'm stating that, like, I know, you've been into some pretty good pods of fishing this year. If you catch fish that are keyed into that hatch and keyed into what's really going on right at that time of the day, at that time of the year, I think there's some pretty big fish that eat out of those pods of fish that'll eat a small caddis or eat eat a baetis or eat some of those smaller hatches. There's big fish that'll come up and eat those things. So, I don't know that my assessment was always right, and now I find myself fishing a lot of these smaller hatches to pods of fish again. Like, I'm really loving it again, fishing to them, and I'm still catching nice fish.
Well, it can be pleasantly surprising to see a bunch of noses and throw in and one's 16, 17-inch rainbow or something. That's like, it's not that unicorn fish we talk about sometimes, that, the downtown Leroy Brown fish where it's like that fish just may be a different, like, critter altogether, right? Got 27-inch fish. Can you get it on a Parachute Adams or a Purple Haze? Absolutely. But that fish is just living a different life than the bulk of our air quoting here, but big fish, right? Our normal big fish, say 17 to 21, 22.
Yep.
That can be taken on little Dries all summer long. That fish, once they get 23, 24, 25, and you start to get to that, like, lifetime style fish for a river, it's why not that many, full long-term dry fly guides have that many 24-plus fish inch to credit. I mean, most of them have something in that range or bigger, but those fish just do something different. If that fish eats a 12-inch rainbow trout, it may not need to eat for 4 or 5 days. So the window of opportunity is different for those fish. But any of that kind of where we start talking about big fish, to 16, 17 and bigger, up into that thing that could eat those fish are available. Like, they really are. And not on every river. I don't know that that's the case for every river. Like, certain hatches, for sure. Because, like you said, all those fish, there's too much going on for them to ignore that bug. Like, if it's blue wings on the Ruby, that's a great place in the spring to find good dry fly fishing. And Mother's Day caddis over there too. It's a sleeper for Mother's Day caddis. That big brown, that 20, 21 inch brown, 19 inch brown, whatever he is or she is, can't deny that food source for that time period. Mm-hmm. Even if a sculpin swims in front of it, it might take advantage of that, which is what you saw, throwing a streamer at the end of that dry fly session. That is fun to watch. Everybody should sit there and watch fish eat before
fun.
they throw, if they have a chance. Like, I get it. Like, there's definitely that, like, I got to get it in there before it stops. But if it's steady and it's going, watch that fish for a while.
It's the prettiest thing on planet Earth to sit on that rock and to watch all those fish. And there were some fish that were eating in there that were 23, 24 coming up and eating those eating those blue wing olives. That was the coolest thing. For 5 minutes I just sat and watched it because I had no choice. I couldn't even throw at them. I couldn't do anything. But just to sit and watch it and watch them come up and to eat. Man, it was the coolest experience. Like I say, it's the best dry fly fishing I saw all year, and I didn't catch one on a dry fly. But it was amazing to watch. But, yeah, if you can just watch those fish, and a lot of it is just taking in the moment. Like all these, to get into a good dry fly hatch with a pot of fish eating, like that's a special moment that you got to work hard to find or to create. And so when you're in it, it's fun just to take it all in and enjoy the experience and just like, man, this is as cool as it gets. Look at this brown trout, these predatory brown trout coming up and eating these flies on the surface. Like, this is magical. But I love that. It seems like you have to spend so many hours to see those really good, like you have to pay your dues and spend your days out and your hours out. But if you spend enough time, whether that's a week or whether that's a month, whatever it is, eventually you just get into one of those magical hatches, magical times where you're catching them, or you're catching big fish or keyed into what you're fishing for. But those are fun times. Like, that's what keeps me motivated, keeps me going out there. But it really is taking in those moments when you get them, because they are special.
All right, guys, that's a wrap. That's the first part to this 2-part episode. Brian just killed it on the podcast. So much great information. So I'll get this part 2 out following this one so you can listen to both episodes. And just what a great guy. Make sure to follow him, Montana Fishman, Instagram. Find him on Facebook, Brian Rosenberg. He's got his website. He does a blog on there. Just super passionate, super knowledgeable. And if you guys are in the market for a trip on the Madison, I couldn't recommend a better guide than Brian. He just does a great job, and you're sure to have a fun time and pick up some good tips along the way. And I'm going to get out and fish with Brian as well. We have not fished together yet, but we're going to make it happen. So thanks for the support, you guys. I appreciate it. I'll get this second part out and check in with you guys next week.